It's finally here, what will likely go down as the most controversial release of 2020. The Last of Us Part 2 came out last week. I spent the weekend playing through it, and I'm here to give my final verdict on this game. Is it the game of the generation like so many reviewers are hailing it as? Or is it a steaming pile of crap like its user score on Metacritic would lead you to believe? Let's start with the things that I really liked about this game. Obviously, to the surprise of no one, this is a gorgeous title. Just as with the original Last of Us, Naughty Dog is closing out Sony's current generation with perhaps the console's best looking exclusive. I don't know if I'd necessarily go as far to say it's better looking than like the RE Engine games, RE2, RE3, as those to me are just so impressive in terms of the character models and those fine details. But when you factor in the sprawling landscapes you're dealing with in The Last of Us 2, it's definitely top tier in terms of visual quality. Gameplay is dramatically improved from the previous game. Combat feels better all around. The gunplay, melee combat is way more intricate. You've got a dodge for melee. Enemies are also inclined to dodge and block your attacks as well. The sneaking is way more interesting as you are dealing with a lot more bigger, vaster environments, a lot of stuff taking place in the forest with lots of places to hide. And beyond that, since we're even further into the zombie apocalypse now, Mother Nature has taken over even more of the world. So even if you are traveling through a location that was once a major city, you can still expect to see a lot of very overgrown foliage taking it over. Again, going off the visual points, just so beautiful. And we've got more enemy types. On the infected side, you've got these stalker ones that are really fun to fight. They've kind of got a velociraptor thing going on, where they spread out, they disperse, and then try to run at you from different angles to swarm you, overwhelm you. Really fun and actually kind of scary to deal with. When you see a big group of them and they all just spread out and you don't know where they all went, it's a bit tense. Even on the human side, there's heavies now that use melee weapons and take more damage to kill. There are different factions you're fighting against in this game. There's one group who are more stealthy. They use mostly bows and arrows and melee weapons, and they whistle to communicate with each other as they hunt you down. And so it can get pretty stressful as you're trying to hide, but you hear those whistles getting louder as they draw closer. Naughty Dog also pulls more tools out of their Uncharted box for this one. There's an all-around greater feeling of adventure with some light platforming, rope climbing, swinging, even more set-piece moments that provide a more thrilling experience and even further variety to the gameplay. I will say that jump button, though, not great. The jump feels very clunky and unnecessary. I think they could have just done the standard, your character jumps as they just run off the ledge deal, and it would have felt better. There are even a few more interesting puzzles this time around, having you use physics as well as even requiring you to actually read some of those many notes you pick up along the way to get like access codes for terminals and that. So yeah, there are some much welcomed, needed, I'd even say, improvements in the gameplay department from the first game into this one. But now, let's get into the story, which I can't believe I'm saying coming off of the first game. The story is where this game goes off the rails. Before I get into the actual story itself, I want to stress that this game is much longer than the original. The first game was about 15 hours or so. Part 2 clocks in at around 25 hours, maybe even a bit more. So that does mean even more cutscenes, even more of what I referred to in my video on the original as exposition hallways where characters just walk and talk for a prolonged period. If stuff like that turned you off from the original, note there is much more of it here. But let's get into the actual story. The game picks up 5 years after the original, and we find our heroes, Ellie and Joel, living in this community headed up by Joel's brother Tommy and his wife Maria that we saw the early stages of in the first game. Now, all this time later, they essentially have a bustling town with power and everything. Yeah, lots changed. We have many new friends, even new love interests to meet. Considering the fact that this is the zombie apocalypse, things couldn't get much better than this, which of course means it can't stay like this for long. A group from their community is soon attacked by a faction known as the wolves, and there are casualties, which lead some into the town deciding to retaliate and get even, which thrusts them into an ongoing war that's been raging between the wolves and another faction known as the Scars, both of which are much more prepared for violence than our people. This is a story largely about vengeance. How far would you be willing to go to get even, to serve justice? It also ties into the theme about humanity that I discussed with the first game. As this bloodthirst consumes you, you may lose more of your humanity and perhaps even lose sight of the things that really matter, what you're even fighting for in the first place. This is heavily conveyed in Ellie, who starts the game still very much like we left her, a more lighthearted, a bit socially awkward, but events completely change her as a person as she devolves into, I'm gonna be straight with you, a killing machine, very Rambo-esque. Whatever you do, stay out of her way.
I'm fucking dead anyway. Why would I tell you anything?
Because I can make it quick. Or I can make it so much worse.
And to go along with this theme, there's a heightened sense of brutality in this game, much more so than was even in the first. And I like it for the most part. I definitely think it fits. Again, this was a thing in the original game. This is a brutal world after all. And with this being a revenge plot, it makes sense, I think, to dial the violence up even further. There's much more gore, maiming, dismemberment, but in some ways, things are done too over the top to the point where I think it's distracting. Like, with killing human enemies, for example, oftentimes they don't just die. Their deaths will be more drawn out, where you'll hear them like gurgling on their blood or letting out these prolonged screams. They can be so over the top that rather than the intended goal of making you feel more emotional, more uncomfortable about killing people, I think it more so comes off as comical. Some of this stuff I also just feel comes off as cheap emotional plays. Like the Wolves faction, they use dogs to help them sniff you out during encounters, which is a cool gameplay mechanic. You have to try to kind of stay far away from the people with dogs as they'll find you eventually. But as a result, this means you will be violently killing a lot of puppers in this game. And again, these are just regular dogs, not like a Resident Evil zombie type deal. So yeah, after I stabbed, shot, exploded about 20 or so dogs, I was just like, okay, I get it. Can we stop this now? You know, it's like, I know you're trying to get me to feel bad for killing these dogs, but it's not like you gave me a choice in the matter. I feel like this whole, look at you, you're a monster type stuff really loses a lot of its impact when the player isn't even given a choice in the matter to begin with. Yeah, they just overplayed some things, I'll say. And I also don't think Ellie was really done justice in this game as a character. While I'll admit I think it's cool seeing her kick so much ass, she more so, like I said, devolves rather than evolves as a character. And it makes sense given the way they play out the story, but it's like, that's the story you chose to tell, and I just think there are way more interesting arcs you could have gone with. I think a lot of this revenge, there's also themes with the different factions of like tribalism, religion as well. They're things that I feel like have been done to death. I just don't really find them that engaging. Now at this point, you're probably thinking, ChiGuy, this sounds pretty awesome actually. Stunning visuals, the gameplay's vastly improved, story doesn't really seem bad. I thought you were going to tell me how this thing goes off the rails. Well, I am, but here's the thing. I've got to get a bit into spoiler territory. Now, I'm going to give you a chance to click off the video to avoid it, but hear me out first on why, because I'm not doing this lightly. I'm not going into spoiler territory for a review on a game that's only been out a few days without giving it a lot of thought. So here's my reasoning. Let me talk a bit about review embargoes. If you're not familiar, game reviewers get early review copies of games, but they're not allowed to talk about certain things until certain dates are hit. Usually there's a set day, even a set time for those reviews to go live. So the day of, a few days before release maybe, you all of a sudden see all the major sites have their reviews pop up typically around the same time because now they're allowed to post. But if that review embargo is lifted before the game releases, as was the case with The Last of Us 2, publishers may still restrict the things you can talk about, because they don't want spoilers out there before the game's actual release, which was also the case with The Last of Us Part 2. But what's interesting about this game is that out of the around 25-hour game, about 12 hours of it, almost half the game, reviewers were not allowed to talk about at all. This is very uncommon for such a large portion of a game to need to be kept under wraps. And now that the game's out, obviously that isn't a requirement anymore. And so that's what I'm about to talk about, because again, I think it's absolutely necessary. So once more, final warning, if you don't want any spoilers for this game, leave the video now. But note, I'm not talking about some specific story spoiler, I'm talking about something that is significant to everything, the story, the gameplay, for close to half of the entire experience. Okay, let's talk about Abby, the hulking golf enthusiast, for those of you familiar with the game's famous leaks. Abby spearheaded that attack on the group of your people that ignites this whole ordeal. She is the main villain of the game, at least for about the first half. The first half of this game, which is all I've really talked about so far, I'd say is very good, great even. But then, after you scratched and clawed your way to get to Abby and seem to about to be having your big final showdown with her, all of a sudden we go way back in time. And you start to play as Abby to get some backstory on her. Now, I've seen this in a lot of games, all media actually, movies, TV. You've got your big bad guy, and then we give you a little flashback or something to sort of humanize them. Maybe have the audience garner some sympathy for them. No surprise, no big deal. But I'm playing this, right? And starting to feel like this is going on kind of long. And then I go into the menus, and this is a gaming moment I'll never forget. I go into the menus while playing as Abby, and I see Abby has her own skill trees, upgrades, etc. And that's because you play as Abby for most of the second half of this entire game. Essentially playing out the same events, time periods that you just did with Ellie, but from Abby's perspective. You get, like I said, history on her, people within her faction that you've been fighting against, all painted in an extremely positive light now. There is an incredibly desperate attempt to make the player not just sympathize with these people, but genuinely like them, which is why they're basically getting their own game within this game. Also, there's an effort to sort of vilify your original protagonists, oftentimes done very cheaply, I think. This thing drags on for what feels like an eternity, and I feel it ends up having the opposite intended effect, that rather than have players come to like these characters, I think they're going to end up hating them even more for having to suffer through this massive section of the game that's dedicated to them. Especially when it seems like things were about to come to a head in the game. Like I said, it seems like you're about to get to the climax, and all of a sudden you're learning about baby mama drama with Abby and her ex-boyfriend and his new girlfriend. I'm sitting there the whole time like, why is this happening? Can I get back to the game I was playing? And none of the gameplay really changes or evolves past this point, so you're doing the same types of things you were doing as Ellie, just now with Abby. Again, feels more so like you're starting a new game now, as you're going around getting upgrades again, many of them the same upgrades you just got as Ellie, acquiring new weapons, etc. Once this portion of the game starts, it just takes the wind out of the entire experience. If you watched my video on The Last of Us Part 1, you'll know I said I believed the game's shorter length played a huge role in keeping the experience from seeming like a slog. This game does the exact opposite. This insanely large, needless padding practically destroys the experience, and it makes the story much worse overall, because not only are you putting focus on these characters people aren't going to care about, but in doing so you're taking focus away from the ones people do care about, or maybe would, because it's like you started the game off, you've got Joel and Ellie obviously, and now they're past and new friends, then you add Abby and all her friends into the mix, and the game's trying to make you care about all these different people. In the end, I think it's going to be hard for people to really care about any of them. I will say having all these characters with the theme being revenge does help amplify the idea of an eye for an eye. You know, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, so it's like you take one of mine, then I take one of yours, then you take another one of mine, which means I gotta take another one of yours. When does it all end? But we don't need things drawn out to this degree to get points like that across. and it's definitely not worth what you lose by not giving significant development time and attention to the core characters. Honestly, if it wasn't for me doing this review, I don't know if I'd even finish this game. I think this would have been one of those titles that I put down for like months after getting to the Abby part, then I come back to it randomly one day, and I'm like, oh, I'd better start this over so I can play it through the beginning, right? And I have fun until I get to the Abby part and put it down again. And if you do manage to get through all that, see this thing to the finale, I think it's an incredibly unsatisfying ending, and a predictable one at that. With the long runtime, like I alluded to, the game really beats you over the head with these themes to the point I think many will see where they're probably going with this. It's almost like the game is constantly shouting at you about how deep it is, while in actuality not even being able to hold a candle to the original narrative-wise. As I said, I think Ellie wasn't given a good enough arc. Both Ellie and Joel, I think, are done dirty in this, and it's like, why? So you can prop up and push these randos that I think are only going to make players feel like you're wasting their time? So all in all, The Last of Us Part 2 is one of my most unique gaming experiences ever. I don't think I've ever had such differing opinions on the first and second halves of a game. I'm not even saying the first half is perfect, but geez, do things immediately go right off a cliff from there. I don't see the logic in why they decided to frame the game this way. Like maybe this Abby thing could have worked as DLC or something they come out with later, which would have allowed you to do her story as well as give proper care and attention to the characters people bought into this experience to be with. Because make no mistake about it, this game was sold on being the continuation of Ellie and Joel's story. They have these characters basically come in and hijack it, and they think players are gonna like them for that? Going into this, I had said I really don't want a direct sequel to The Last of Us, and after playing through Part 2, I think maybe I would actually be down for a follow-up, but definitely not the one we got. Anyway, with that, this video's a wrap. Let me know your thoughts on The Last of Us 2 in the comments. Are you currently playing the game? Are you as disappointed in it as I am? And what do you think about this big narrative twist? Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this discussion of The Last of Us 2. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. And if you want to keep the conversation going, hit me up on Twitter at JohnnyZakari and join my Discord, ChiGuy and Friends. Link to both in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching.